Hello and welcome to this Monday Memorial Day, a somber remembrance of those who have fallen in our military in wartime around the world. So despite the celebratory beginning of summer, barbecues, parades, and whatnot, I choose to recognize this as a pretty somber and sad but important time of remembrance. Now, that said, certainly we're okay to have a nice weekend, and we did have a nice weekend. And we are heading into Chapter 3. And this is variables and measurement. And I think it's important to talk right now about an aspect of this course that is not clearly defined, but it will be in the next version of this course book. And that is that this course focuses on quantitative research. In the next version of the course book, I'm going to be adding the other ways in which we do research. And that is, first and foremost, qualitative research. Now, qualitative research and quantitative research are one's dealing with numbers, measures, and statistics. The other one is research that is done that tries to capture the sense of an experiential or field-based experience. Very different kind of research. I was raised in this field to really quantify things in numbers, and that was the way to move the field forward. Since that time, qualitative research has become useful. It's become a part of studies. It's become the sole methodology for some studies. Sometimes it's just the only way that we can actually do something like that. Those two methods, kind of like covering most of research, however, not necessarily exclusive. Sometimes you'll find quantitative research. In fact, that's most of the research out there. Sometimes you'll find qualitative research, but oftentimes you'll find what's called mixed method. And that is a methodology that uses an experiment or a study that uses both. So you may, for instance, start off with a statistics from a survey, and then you'll do focus groups after. So statistics from the survey, dividing people up into groups, and then you might have representatives from each one of those groups having a discussion on, let's say, the upcoming candidates for president of the United States. And you might have, statistically, you get from your survey whatever other variables you're looking at and divide up the groups and see what happens. So you have this methodology that covers both quantitative and qualitative study. Now, so we have quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. One more, in general, are called it's escaping me now. I should have wrote this down. It's meta-analysis. Sorry about that. A meta-analysis is quantitative and qualitative. It could be quantitative, qualitative, or both, but it's actually an examination of a number of studies. It's when we take, let's say there's all kinds of studies. Here's a great example. There's all kinds of studies defining personality using trait perspective. A meta-analysis was conducted years ago about all those different theories, and they found that they shared something in common. Those common traits have now become what we call the Big Five personality traits. They spell OCEAN. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those five were identified in a meta-analysis that looked at all kinds of trait theories, and those were the five most common ones that appeared across those. So they sort of said these must be the Big Five, and that's sort of how it's done. So that kind of research can happen too. Now, there's other methodologies like longitudinal and cross-sectional and stuff like that when we talk about methods, and those appear at the end of the book. But right now, up until now, I've really never made that distinction. Now, making that distinction and now turning our attention back to Chapter 3, when we're talking about variables and measures, we're snugly into the quantitative world, because what we are looking at is when we examine the variables, when we're looking for relationships between the variables that we want to understand, let's say intelligence and wealth. We want to look at those two variables to see how they relate to one another. We have to, within our study, take the opportunity to define how are we going to measure each one of those variables. So we do what's called an operational definition. You take an intro to psych, there's a lot of ways to measure intelligence. So let's pick one. We're going to have to pick one and tell our reader, this is how we're defining intelligence, and this is how we're measuring it. It might be, let's say it's IQ. We're just going to pick that one. We're going to call it IQ, and we're measuring it on the standard IQ, different standard deviations, but the average is 100. We're going to look at those scores. Then we look at wealth. Okay, how are we going to define wealth? Is it annual income? It's maybe it's their net worth, or maybe it's the kind of car that they drive, because we're only going to make an observation. I mean, we don't know. So we pick one. We might pick, we're going to ask everybody to tell us their annual income. We might pick another one and say, we want to know what your net worth is. Another one, because we don't want to pry too deeply, those are personal, and we might say, what kind of car you drive. And you see there's different areas. Whenever we pick a variable, we are playing around with how valid it could be. How valid is an IQ score? How valid in representing intelligence, and how valid is the type of car someone drives in truly representing their wealth? Those are questions that we have to ask as we are looking at designing our study and how we're going to measure them. So if we have a score for IQ that we're going to use. That's how we're going to measure it. That's the quantitative number that we're going to use. And then maybe we'll categorize different cars together, cheap, little bit, lower mid, upper mid, high, and, luxury and supercars, kind of thing. We have those 5 levels. So over here we have sort of a nominal ordinal scale of information on this side, and we have a ratio scale over on this side, although there's really no zero intelligence theoretically, but the number could go to 0. So that number, so you have a ratio and you have the kind of nominal ordinal sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 5 being the highest wealth. Now we have the numbers. So we have the variables, then how are we defining them, and then how are we measuring them? How are we actually going to convert information into numbers that we can then apply statistics, which is necessary for quantitative research. So, in the discussion, I'm asking you, and I talked about it a little bit here, discuss the implications of picking this. What happens? I would like you to actually look up this term, opportunity cost. When we choose to go one way, it means we put our resources in that direction when it could have gone to some other place. So that's a little hint as to how you want to think about when we're picking specific variables and how we're going to measure them for our studies. What's the potential loss? What are the potential risks? A little bit about validity and all those things. So that's what I'm having you discuss with examples, and where we can even bring examples from your study that you're working on. Okay. Then For the quiz, pretty straightforward. I want you to define and distinguish between the independent variable and the dependent variable. You have to have that really clear because it's the direction of the experiment or the study or the relationship between two variables. Then we're going to look at a concept called the Hawthorne effect. It has a really rich, it's a very important time in the history of psychology when this was going on, particularly industrial organizational psychology, the actual Hawthorne experiment itself and what did it produce. But it also produced what we call the Hawthorne effect. And I would like you to define that and give an example. Not the one from the original story. I want you to, there's all kinds of examples of Hawthorne effect. You have experienced Hawthorne effect. I guarantee it. So you got to get your head wrapped around that idea. What is the Hawthorne effect? And then an example of how you have experienced it. The special assignment that is due this week is last week's content. And that has to do with your consent. Now, for your study, you're going to have to draw up a document that meets all the criteria for consent that we talked about last week, that you learned about last week. This is actually in the format that you would present to potential participants in your study. So it has to be in the present tense. It has to have a signature line. It has to be, I understand, and then all the listing of the different information that's there. If you look up, valid informed consent forms, it's going to be there. And you can, rip that stuff off. But make sure that you go through the criteria that is available to understand what needs to be included in there. Now, we may turn that into a digital format with digital ways of signing, but what I want you to do in your paper is in the appendix, you're going to put, what would this look like if I was printing it out and giving it to people for them to sign consent before they participated in my study? So that's what I'm going to be looking for this week. Now, that said, we're still working on assignment 1. And so we got to get that finished and going. And then you can go on to assignment 2. Assignment 2 is due next Sunday, so there's plenty of room. And assignment 2 is really not that big of a deal. It's just not as important as assignment 1. So go ahead, if you're waiting for my feedback, then go ahead and write up your consent and start working on that and stuff. But meanwhile, we're going to be making your assignment 1 perfect. So, and once that's ready to go, then you're going to make a copy of assignment 1, call it assignment 2, and then insert your consent or your informed consent document into the appendix. And that's going to be the only thing I'm grading on this second paper. The rest of it will already be graded from assignment 1. So that's where we're at, and that's it for this week. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion on operational definitions and helping us get our heads wrapped around that idea. Please put in some of the information from your study and kind of work that out, because that's the next assignment after consent, is you're going to be going into your methods section and you're going to be defining your variables and how you're going to measure them. And so it's a great time to discuss those openly right in the discussion board and help each other work out the kinds of data that you're dealing with. So good opportunity to work together on that. So have a great week. It's really nice and sunny. I hope it stays sunny all week. Do take much care, and I will see you next time.